Good morning, Tony Dottino here, doing my live with Tony, and wanted to share with you this morning several things that I've been involved with this past week on people looking for help on different ways of remembering things that are impactful in their life. And the simplest one that comes up over and over again, we've talked about many times, which is I need to remember the names and faces of the people that I meet in my business. And therefore, can you help me learn how to improve the names of the people and even remember something about them so as I try to grow my business and I get the opportunity of meeting people and I get to follow up with them and talk to them a little bit, I can have some level of social conversation before we get into the business agenda. And it locks in a few things. Think of the words that the person used, which, hey, is there something you could teach me so I can remember some things about the person so I can engage in some social conversation before we get into the business agenda? And it brings me back to my travels when I used to go to Latin American countries. And one of the things that I learned when I went to Brazil or Argentina or Costa Rica, Venezuela, even Mexico, is they taught me that when I was coming from the United States to discuss business for IBM at that time, it was important that I build a little bit of the social aspects. The cultures in some of these countries was not, let's just dive into the business and we're done. It was, let's take a few minutes to talk about a family or some interest or a hobby or a challenge or a problem, something on a personal level a little bit so that people get to know you a little bit on a different level than just, hey, let's get to work and be done with it, which is obviously from an American culture such as a business. In the U.S., we're trying to get things done, right? We're busy. Hey, let's get to it. And who's got time to take, first 5 minutes of an agenda to discuss personal stuff or social things? And so it was always important to step back and say, okay, let me at least find some things. So now I get people asking me, so how do I remember the names and faces? And so the very first thing I always tell people is you cannot immediately engage in what you want to say to someone. When you're meeting them, your priority needs to be to let them speak and learn a few things about them. Look, you're an expert on what you want to talk about, so you don't need to dive right into that and tell them how wonderful or how spectacular you are. And let me say about my family and my kids, when you're meeting a person for the first time, you've got to put your mindset into the first 5 minutes of a conversation has got to be me focused on learning everything I can about them, starting with their name. And so there are different techniques that you can do this. People have used famous stars, and well, I'll think of that star when I see them standing next to this person, so it'll help me remember my name. So, for example, if I meet somebody who's Walter, I may see them standing next to Walt Disney at the Magic Kingdom, with Mickey Mouse holding up. And so when I see this person next, I see them with Walt Disney. Ah, that's Walt. Well, Walter. What's also interesting about that is it requires you to look at their face. So the hidden agenda there is you want to focus on a person's face. Something unique. Let's see what I'm trying to... There we go. Maybe they've got some landmark. Maybe they've got a mustache. Hopefully they're not going to shave it off when you see them next time. You don't want to use glasses unless the person's wearing glasses all the time. But if they've got glasses on all the time, they may change their frames. That may throw you off. So you want to try to see if you can picture the person and their eyes and maybe the color of their eyebrows. Something about their face that at least immediately says, God, I'm going to link that. See him standing next to Mickey Mouse with Walt Disney, and that's Walter. And so our brains are working with what we call associations. How do we make associations to information? And that principle applies to just anything you want to remember. So remember, our brains are branching, linking, connecting, and associating machines, if you want to look at it from a machine and mechanical point of view. So how will we, first of all, look at it and realize we're going to branch, we want to make an association, we want to link that association, and we want to connect it. And if we can do those three things in anything that we're trying to remember, then we're in business. We'll talk about that again in some other application, so we're not just doing names and faces this morning. But names and faces is the one that comes up most. I was at a meeting last evening with our HOA group, and the very first thing, it was a budget meeting, which you can imagine how interesting a budget meeting is, especially when there's a big increase in the HOA fees. And so each person had to get up that wanted to speak, from the residents to the board members, and they had to start with their name and where their street address was. And somebody would look at that and their name and the street, and okay, you have 3 minutes to talk about whatever issues you're concerned about in terms of our budget. What was very interesting about the rules of the HOA, each person was able to get up and talk for 3 minutes, but they wanted answers to their questions, and the rules of the board were you can ask the question, but we have to contemplate and work together as a board to get an answer. So we'll save that for the end of our question period, which was kind of like, okay, I guess if those are the rules of how HOAs work, then we'll collect the information and then obviously assemble that in developing our budget for 2026. So it was an interesting thing, but the important thing is what, remembering the names of each person. So the first thing you have to think about is, do I want to remember that person's name? And if I do, then I've got to look and I've got to catch what their name was. Now in this case, it's a public forum. I always like to spell a person's name. So if Robert, introduced themselves, I'd say, okay, in my mind, I go, Robert, hey, is that R-O-B-E-R-T? And nobody's ever found that I was rude in getting them to spell their name back to me. But that helps me to do is focus on the person's face, spell their name to capture each letter. You know how we play some of these games where you're missing letters in a word? I capture each letter, R-O-B-E-R-T, lock it into some feature on their face, may make a connection to somebody I know by the name of Robert, which I have several people I know by Robert. And the next thing I know, when I look at that person and I look at that feature, bam, it's, hey, that's R-O-B-E-R-T. I see my friend standing next to them, and now I can remember their name. And it's a very simple technique. And so in watching the different people getting up and speak, the important thing that the audience members, the residents in the community remembered was the name of the board members. So we got 7 board members. And so there were a few times when a person got up and said, is that Chad, C-H-A-D? And so it was interesting how that interaction took place with the residents of the community who unfortunately probably only come to these meetings like once a year when they have something to complain about, as opposed to on a monthly basis to say, how can I help shape the community on an ongoing basis? And so it was an interesting meeting and getting different people up, and there were a couple of people that I want to hopefully see in the community and go back and have some conversation with, because they, one, for example, doing power washing, his own business, and I remember what his name was, and unfortunately he made his point and piece and took off, and I didn't get a chance to see him after the meeting, but I'd certainly be interested in talking to him about his power washing service right within the community. Especially since he gave what his fees are for doing the power washing and differently. And so, in any case, it was an interesting meeting, and for today's Alive with Tony, I just want to cover the one aspect of names and faces as one of the elements that people are always looking to. How do I remember people's names and faces? And last night was an example of a room packed with people where you would have to remember the names of people, at least the board members, and then, of course, some of the keynote speakers, or some of the people that spoke that had key thoughts that you wanted to capture. We'll pick up what I'll call steps in a process, steps in a procedure, things that you remember in a sequence. We'll pick that up on Friday.